Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 323 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be discussing the new movie Sorry to Bother You, directed by Boots Riley. And this will involve spoilers for everything in the movie, so just be aware of that. And I'm joined by three guests. So, first up, we've got Evan Narcisse, who you may remember from our panel on Black Panther back in episode 302. He's written about video games, comic books, and pop culture for IO9, Kotaku, Time, and Techland. And he also wrote the Rise of the Black Panther comic for Marvel. So, Evan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, David.
Then next up, we've got Tananarive Due, who you also may remember from our panel on Black Panther. Her novels include The Living Blood, Joplin's Ghost, and My Soul to Keep. And her short story collection Ghost Summer won the 2016 British Fantasy Award. She teaches classes on Afrofuturism and Black Horror at UCLA. And you should also check out her online Afrofuturism class over at afrofuturismwebinar.com. So Tananarive, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
And also joining us today is Craig Laurance Gidney, who you may remember from our panel on Queers Destroy Horror back in episode 173. He's the author of the young adult novel Bereft, and his collection Skins Eat Magic and See Swallow Me and Other Stories were both finalists for the Lambda Literary Award. So Craig, welcome to the show.
Welcome, and hello to everyone.
Okay, so let's start off with Evan and have you just tell us what it was like watching Sorry to Bother You for the first time.
Sorry to Bother You, I saw for the first time at South by Southwest in March. I had a few film critic friends see it at Sundance this January, but there wasn't that much chatter about it. I knew it was something I wanted to see, mostly because I'm a Lakeith Stanfield fan, but nothing really prepared me for what I wound up seeing. It was amazing. I thought it was like, mindfuckery of the highest order, but also amazingly clear and assured in its handling of its like thematic and political subjects. And also a great piece of character work too. The characters move through arcs that are compelling and familiar and riveting. I think it's one of the best debut movies from a first-time filmmaker I've ever seen.
When you said that you were a Lakeith Stanfield fan already, and he's the star, he plays the main character in the movie. What were you familiar with him from before?
Yeah, Lakeith plays Cassius Green, the main character. Sorry to Bother You. I mostly knew him from his work on Atlanta, the Donald Glover series that's on FX. He's also in Get Out in a small but important role, but it was mostly Atlanta I knew him from, and he plays Darius, the kind of stoner friend, philosopher friend on Atlanta.
Yeah, so if people have seen Get Out, he plays the guy who gets sort of abducted in the first scene. Who comes back later and is the one who says, get out.
Andre.
In the movie.
Andre, yeah.
Yeah. And so then, Evan, you actually interviewed the director of the movie. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I interviewed Boots Riley. If I'm remembering correctly, it was in May. I'd known his work as a rapper, as a member of the Coup. I'm not the world's biggest Coup fan. I have friends of mine who could definitely claim that title, but I was familiar with his work, and I knew that their music was always politically oriented, activist minded, left leaning, concerned with things that we'd probably call socialist concerns, redistribution of wealth and corporate malfeasance. Very much pointed out in a funny, entertaining way. And that same ethos shows up in the movie. So I talked to him a little bit about that, but mostly the interview I did with him that ran on IO9 talked about his journey to getting the film made. He's always wanted to be a filmmaker. He went to school for filmmaking, and getting the screenplay published in McSweeney's after being introduced to David Eggers. So it's what was interesting is that Boots very easily talks about his goals for the movie and his journey to getting the movie made. Talking to him, I got the sense that he was a very humble, down to earth dude, but also with strongly held ideas. Oftentimes I think the way we perceive creativity in mainstream media is that if you have strong ideas, you have to be really abrasive or maladroit socially. But Boots was a good guy to talk to. He clearly, has had a lot of experience talking about his movie when I talked to him, but it still felt like a very personal and important work to him. And I think when I spoke to him, like the first wave of big publicity really hadn't hit for the movie yet, or was in process. And I think he's very ready to use the movie and the conversations around it to talk about the politics that are important to him. And I think that's great.
It's interesting. I watched a bunch of interviews with him, and he was saying, I think it was his father was a fairly prominent activist or labor organizer sort of person, and Boots was saying that we have this organized sort of activism moved into a stage where it was all about events, about getting people to all get out into the streets and make noise, and that's important, but that an older school of organization was that you have to get to know people and form organizations. And he says that the people who really prospered in that were very affable and joking around and were well liked by everybody, people who could organize their workplaces. And so it's interesting you note that he does have this sort of sociability about him. And one of the actors, I don't remember who it was, said that, I think it was maybe Lakeith, but he was saying that he was just hanging out with Boots in Oakland and that he just knows everybody in Oakland. That they just walk around and people wave to him and say hi and come up and talk to him. And yeah, that he's this sort of fixture of the Oakland social scene.
Yeah, the sense I got talking to him is that he's been in Oakland his entire life. And people I know who know Oakland better than I'm a native New Yorker, but yeah, he's been a fixture of Oakland for decades, the art and political scenes there. So it's interesting that he is right dead center of this moment that Oakland is having on the screen.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so Tananarive, let's get you in here. Talk about sort of what did you heard about this movie and kind of what were your first impressions going into it?
Well, I teach at UCLA, so I heard about it through the grapevine at UCLA. And I think it was in May, in fact, Boots Riley, maybe even a cast, came to the campus and they were going to do a Q&A and a screening. And I got on the list, but ultimately could not go and hurt my own feelings so badly because because I just knew, I don't like to read a lot about a film before I see it if there's a lot of excitement. I like to go in knowing as little as possible. And just what little I had heard was that it was just wildly imaginative. And the trailer about the code switching and the white voice, I was like, okay, this has my attention. And then finally just saw it in the theater, opening weekend with my husband, Stephen Barnes, who's also a science fiction writer. And we loved it. I knew I would love it, but I absolutely loved it. It had just this outrageous creativity, really insurgency that meant I couldn't keep ahead of it. Just when I thought I knew where it was going, it would zig left and zag right. And at one point I was afraid I might hit a threshold where it was like, oh, I lost it. I can't hang with this. But instead, I just kept getting more excited, like wanting to raise my fist in the theater. I was completely riding the film's vibe, and by the time, I know this is a spoiler broadcast, so by the time the Equusapiens are revolting, and it was just one of my favorite moments in the film, being flung down this rabbit hole and inside screaming, yes, yes, yes. And, the whole way, like finally, someone said it. Equusapiens, yes, if they could, they would. It's just, when you start, cause I come from a family of activists. So my late mother, Patricia Stevens Due, spent 49 days in jail with her sister, my aunt Priscilla Krause, in 1960, and other Florida A&M University students. She was arrested many, many times, in and out of jail. She once told me I went to jail so you wouldn't have to, which I have basically taken to heart. But at the same time, I have a deep appreciation and understanding for protest space, movements, this conversation about the purity in the movement and the squabbling and infighting that goes on in movement. Even that is included in the story. But also, I think more importantly, just this visual reminder with context that when we band together, we can create change. I think a lot of people are living in kind of a helpless space right now. And with good reason, in a lot of ways. So we have a society where when you start with the dehumanization of mass incarceration, which has been separating families for generations, and then also now throwing migrant families and children in cages, it's not that wild a leap that corporations would literally strip us of humanity if it benefited them. And the system would do that. And we can see it in our current political environment. After a bit of outrage in the media, life goes on. Life goes on. It's like, oh, okay, they're making horse people, whatever. Meanwhile, what's on Netflix this weekend? And Evan also talked about the relatability of the characters. Tessa Thompson's Detroit. I just saw a lot of myself in her in the sense of I am an artist and I also have an activist heart, and we're always sort of struggling with that question of, is the art enough? Is the art effective enough? Really, the most difficult scene in the movie for me is her art show, and how, to me, her image of what she was accomplishing was sort of, disintegrating for me as it became a harmful kind of imagery in space and a harmful relationship between the artist and the audience. So anyway, I really, really love the film. I took one of my best friends to see it with me the second time, and it's just a delight all the way through.
Well, let's back up a little bit and talk about, for people who have not seen the movie and maybe haven't even seen the trailer, could you talk about what you meant about code switching in the trailer and just kind of what your reaction was to that?
Well, sure. The one thing I did know was this idea of, you're not going to make any sales that way. You have to use your white voice. That question about the white voice. Now, full disclosure, I was raised in the suburbs and bused into an inner city school from the suburbs. So I would have given anything to have a black voice, frankly. That was like my big dream, was for people not to be able to hear the suburbs in my voice. But this is a very real question, whether you're buying real estate, the difference in reactions when they talk to you on the phone and then they see you in person and realize you're black. This is all real. And it's daily, and it's from school to work. It just follows us. And this whole notion of code switching and fitting in and putting people at ease with our demeanor, starting with the voice, because we are so scary and foreign to people and all of this kind of conversation. So if the movie had just been about that alone, I would have loved it as well. But that was just such a small piece of where Sorry to Bother You was going.
Right. So the setup of the movie is that there's a young black man played by Lakeith Stanfield, and he lives in his uncle's garage and is really tight. Money is really tight. And so the movie opens with him sort of applying for a job at a telemarketing firm, and sort of he has a Employee of the Month plaque and a big science fair trophy or something that turned out to be fake that he's using to apply for this job. I actually heard in an interview Boots Riley said that a friend of his actually would do stuff like this, and that's where he got the idea for that.
That's hysterical.
But they do actually end up hiring him for this telemarketing job, but he just calls people and says, sorry to bother you, and they instantly hang up on him until the guy in the cubicle next to him, played by Danny Glover, tells him that he has to use his white voice. And this is a sort of magical realism element, where it's just the actors' voices are dubbed over with what is very obviously a completely different white actor's voice.
Yes, Patton Oswalt, I believe, is his voice, and I love this distinction that it's not just making your voice sound nasally, like black comedians do in comedy shows when they're imitating whites. It's a frame of mind. It's an attitude. I love that.
Yeah, so from my research, I think it was David Cross for Lakeith Stanfield, and then you're right, Patton Oswalt was for Amari
Hardwick.
You're right, my bad.
But yeah, so that's sort of the basic setup of the movie. And so, Craig, what did you think going into the movie? Did you have expectations? What did you think about this sort of opening setup stuff?
Well, I actually thought that it was completely going to be about code switching. And as it turns out, it really wasn't. I mean, that was a piece of it, But the thing that sort of got me was the entire sort of underpinning of it. The white voice is sort of like an aspirational voice. It's not necessarily just sounding white. It's also sounding a sort of, you're completely bought into capitalism kind of mindset. And you're completely bought into selling things. And the fact that his name is Cassius Green, Cash Green, it's on the nose, but I actually kind of admire the fact that it sort of went there and it sort of made an idea and sort of turned it into turned symbols into reality. For instance, the guy named Cassius Green, the Equusapiens, the fact that the white voice is literally magical. I went in not expecting it to be as sort of deep as it was. It really struck me as being sort of like a anti-capitalist screed, anti-capitalist / consumerist screed, sort of hiding in a sort of black comedy of manners. And a lot of people sort of go in expecting one thing, but it goes completely in a completely opposite direction. And I really admired that about it. And I also admired the fact that he got funding for it, because these days movies are so, X-Men meets, I don't know, the Joy Luck Club or something like that. They're very segmented, the way that they sell them. But this one completely went off the rails, and it held it together, but just the entire way that it was done, it was just wonderful. I love the movie.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that no one is going into this movie expecting this movie. I mean,
how could you?
Exactly.
Actually, and so Tananarive mentions that the main character has a girlfriend, played by Tessa Thompson. The character's name is Detroit. Craig, what did you think of that character?
Oh, people sort of thought that she was kind of a manic pixie dream girl, but I don't think so. I think she was way more, had way more agency and she was more radical than Cash was. And her art was I didn't particularly like her art, but it was at least confrontational. And, it's funny because I just finished seeing Tessa Thompson in Westworld. And of course spoiler alert, you hate her in that one. But in this one, she was really lovable.
Well, right, yeah. So she's an artist, and she has, as you say, these very confrontational earrings that she wears throughout the movie.
Yes.
And she also does sort of performance art, where... See, I saw this movie a couple weeks ago now, but she's sort of mostly naked on stage, and people are throwing meat at her, and she's wearing sunglasses.
Cell phones.
Is that about right?
Cell phones. And then her another part of her performance art, though I'm not sure if it was, is that she would just spin signs around, sort of pointing out how empty consumerism is in this sort of weird dystopic world. Because that's another layer, that it was a dystopia. It wasn't like a Hunger Games dystopia exactly, but it was a dystopia. It was sort of capitalism gone amok. And she sort of was the window into that, reminding people that everything is not all right. This is a little crazy. The world is a little crazy.
Well, you mentioned, Craig, that you didn't like her art. Were we meant to like her art, do you think?
I don't think so. I think that the way that she was written is that she was both intelligent, but at the same time, she was a part of the comedy too. Her art was kind of a part of the comedy as well. Like, it was sort of like what people think a performance artist does in, I don't know, a 1980s performance artist or something.
Does anyone disagree with that? Does anyone think that we were supposed to have a more sort of positive outlook on her art?
I mean, her art was clearly a political commentary as well. It was, I think, more heavy-handed than the text it was happening in, you know?
Yes.
So it was maybe an element of self-parody to like, to diffuse any, a critique that people might have about the movie. It's like, look, yes, I know what I'm doing. I'm making a movie about horse people and, the exploitation of labor. And I'm showing you that I know what I'm doing, and the absurdity of it by placing the same artistic ambitions inside this character who makes art that is, very heavy-handed. I thought it was brilliant. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I see.
No, it's all good. No.
And who is not as great an artist as Boots Riley is. Let's just put it that way. You know, that's what you're saying, Evan. She's trying. Her passion is there. But I really found that moment, like the second time I saw it, that was my time to go grab, refreshments during that show, because it really is kind of painful. And I'm sure maybe it's meant also to be painful, because it does go on a bit with the people are throwing cell phones at her and they're hitting her hard. I mean, the last time we see her, she's putting a helmet on. It's about to go down, you know, and I don't think that that's a healthy space for her as an artist. I think all of that passion is being slightly misdirected. And what is she bringing out in the audience? You know, that anger, which is ostensibly directed at capitalism and the exploitation of nations' resources, is turning into, you know, something out of Shirley Jackson in the lottery. You know, it takes a real turn there. So I find that kind of brilliant in how badly her art actually played for me.
Well, so Craig mentioned that there are these dystopian aspects. Evan, do you want to talk about that? Just talk about the dystopian aspects of this world that the movie creates.
Yeah, it's very much, you know, a fever nightmare of late stage capitalism, right? Where people work as hard as they can, and still can't get by. You know, Cash's uncle, presumably has a job, but he's like, you know, several months behind on his mortgage. None of the people at the call center, seemed like they were like flush, you know, except for the power callers. Like even the manager who's, Cash's like best friend in the first act of the movie, the guy who keeps on like kind of, preaching about the power callers and whatnot. You see pictures of him, you know, shaking hands with all these powerful people, connected people, but he's, you know, he's kind of grimy and scattershot. Like he's a, I think kind of a cautionary tale that, you know, capitalism unto itself is not necessarily going to make you happy. So it's very dystopian. And then when you get to the ads about Worryfree, the kind of modern day slavery that's gussied up with these political these commercials. It's scary. You know, you're basically talking about surrendering all your agency to be a cog in a machine that's gonna squeeze you dry. It's all presented in a very darkly humorous way, like Craig said, but it is scary if you think about it. It's parallels to the real world.
Well, right, and Tananarive was mentioning that too, the sort of parallels between Worryfree and the prison industrial complex. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, it's just a basic level of dehumanization that I think Worryfree is sort of the first level of. But if you dig more deeply into it, you have an entire plan to make workers even more efficient by turning them into Equusapiens, which, again, does not even sound as far-fetched as it should. It really doesn't. And what's so interesting about Worryfree, speaking of dystopia, is that it reminds me something straight out of Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, you know, where very much a dystopian novel, where society is falling apart and people have to seek out these kinds of worry-free work environments where they might sell your children from under you, you know, and all this kind of thing, which again speaks to sort of vocabulary we are growing accustomed to as a society. Separating families has been an acceptable practice, as I said, under mass incarceration for generations. It's just quiet. It's not in the headlines. When you're in the prison system, you are in a dark hole, as Jordan Peele, said when he did Get Out, in terms of what the sunken place is. You're locked in a dark hole. And that is the prison industrial complex. And that is, with a shiny sort of veneer, the road Worryfree leads to. Because what's in the fine print? That's the question. What's in the fine print? So yeah, very dystopian. And also the interaction of, consumerism, advertising, media, entertainment. I loved the messaging there overall. Like, for instance, there were moments in the movie where a political conversation or thought would be interrupted by a television screen showing this inane program. I forget what it was called, where people just get the hell beat out of you, I think it's called.
Yeah, I got the shit kicked out of me, is what it's called.
I got the shit, which, could almost be a real show. There are probably several shows that almost fit that guideline. It's just a slight exaggeration, and our eye is drawn to it, and it silences conversation, and it silences outrage. It silences, it obscures awareness. So I thought all of that is just brilliant.
Well, right. And so Cash learns how to use his white voice and starts becoming a very successful telemarketer caller. And as Evan was pointing out, there's this sort of upstairs where there's this sort of glowing golden elevator and all these well-dressed people. And this is held out as if you just work hard, you can ascend to these heights where everything's wonderful. And so Cash eventually does sort of get kicked upstairs. And so Craig, do you want to talk about what did you think of when he makes it upstairs? What did you think of that part?
I think that what happened is he got seduced by the entire culture of it, and he sort of lost his way. And that section of the film was sort of him actually becoming an avatar of his name, Cash Green, because he sort of loses sight of, for instance, before he moves upstairs, he's actually a part of the group that wants to rebel against the company. And then he all of a sudden starts walking across the picket line, and he ends up becoming also a symbol of what not to be when the person throws a rock at him or something and gets hit on the head.
It's a Coke can, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a Coke can. And the entire thing about him sort of being seduced into that world and slowly peeling back the layers and seeing how it's really based on exploitation was really powerful. And it was very funny, too. It was very funny. Because I could easily see myself, getting a whole bunch of money and just sort of living in a wonderful house and all that and pretending that everything doesn't exist. The horror doesn't exist.
Well, Ryan, let's set that up because there's the sort of lower level telemarketers who Cash has left behind. And so there's his friend played by Jermaine Fowler. His name is Salvador, I think. And then there's this guy Squeeze, played by Stephen Yun, who's this guy. He sort of goes from business to business, trying to organize the workers. And then his girlfriend Detroit has started working at this call center, and so they're all trying to organize a strike. And I agree with you, Craig, that the movie does a really good job of just making you feel how scary it is going on strike, and how Cash, how difficult this is for him to give up this the stuff he's gotten, even though it's turned out to not be as great as he sort of thought it was going to be.
He ends up saving his uncle's house from foreclosure. So you kind of see where he's coming from, where the seduction comes from.
Yeah. Tananarive, what did you think of the strike and the Cash crossing the picket line and stuff?
Well, let's look at, the parallels. If you work hard, you might go to the big house. And that's kind of what I saw. That's tried and true. If you're in prison and you're good, you might become a trustee, and therefore become a de facto oppressor. And I thought it was illustrated really, really well with a lot of quirkiness in terms of the complication of the password in the elevator, having an impossible number of numbers to remember, and the way the woman was immediately turning her sexual energy toward him, kind of those expected benefits of success to keep people, I guess, sharp. I don't know. But every moment of it seemed very well thought out, from the workspace to the timing of how he had to cross the line just as the organizing is starting, and how difficult it is to sustain movement on many levels, not just because people are seduced by power, and I think our human drive to do something well, to excel at something, to feel, it's a very human predicament. I remember when I was in college, I was thrilled to be offered a chance to work at a local news station on election night. And it was only later I learned that the reason we were invited was because the workers were on strike, And so I had been sort of tricked by a professor into crossing a picket line I didn't realize was going to be there or was there. I didn't know what was going on, In his case, he has this uncle, like you said, and he has a good woman, and he wants to excel, and it's very, very difficult to fight that temptation in the face of uncertainty.
One comment about the movie that really struck me is this is Brianna Joy Gray in The Intercept. She says, after seeing the film, I struggled to recall an instance in which a labor strike had been represented at all in mainstream cinema, much less depicted heroically. Evan, what do you think about that? Do you agree with that? That it's pretty unusual?
Yeah, it's definitely unusual. The only example that comes to mind for me is the old Sally Field movie.
Norma Rae.
One more time, Tananarive?
Norma Rae.
That's right, Norma Rae. Yeah, that's the only thing I can think of in memory. I'm maybe 9 to 5 if you want to be generous in your reading of it, but yeah, it's definitely not a mainstream idea or something that we see portrayed that much. What really got to me about the labor politics thematics about this movie was how it echoed some of the realizations I had when I was part of a organized workers' organization movement. I wasn't a big part of it at all. I was rank and file, but a couple of years ago, Gawker Media organized to become part of the Writers Guild of America, the East chapter, and we had lots of conversations about whether this is a thing we wanted to do or not. And one of the things that those conversations highlighted is something that we all know about capitalism, but we choose to turn a blind eye to, which is in order for one person or a few people to be successful, a lot of people have to be unsuccessful, right? Or less financially secure, so that we can prop up this myth that America's a place where you can, become rich just by working hard. Eventually, as you move up the ladders of socioeconomic status, it's other people's labor that's going to make you rich and not your own. And the movie really puts that in crystal clear terms. And it also presents equally as clearly how workers have to organize to secure their own well-being and their futures in a system like capitalism, right? One thing that I've been seeing across my cohort, people who work in media, and there's lots of different organizations that are organizing now and creating unions, is that yeah, it's really the idea that is better to work as a collective, not just for yourself as an individual, but as for a whole. Like, this is a better thing for the industry as a whole. And I'm talking about, like, internet editorial as a very, small niche portion of the area I have awareness and personal involvement with. But yeah, when it comes time to negotiate better pay or time off, or any issue that can affect an individual person, it's better to do it collectively, because the next time the problem comes up, somebody else will have the benefit of prior experience, of a template, of a roadmap to address these issues, as opposed to dealing with a manager who could easily say, this has never happened before, you're an anomaly, go sit down and be quiet. So that stuff, the labor thematics of Sorry to Bother You are excellent in that regard, because you see after that first strike, the power that collective movement can have on a corporate level, like two corporate actors. You can see them kind of stunned and cowed, and it's a powerful thing.
Well, you were saying, Evan, that the movie kind of reminds you. I'm not familiar with the movie you mentioned, Norma Rae. Is that what's called?
I feel so old right now.
I was the one who mentioned it, but yeah, if I remember correctly, Sally Field plays somebody who works in an auto plant.
No, it's a textile worker. She's a
textile, right? Yeah, you take it, Tananarive.
Actually, that's Craig. Craig seems to know the plot better than we do.
And she leads a strike against people.
Yeah, it's a very stirring performance. It's probably one of Sally Field's best, most beloved performances, which is why it's actually interesting that so few films take up this question of labor movement when all of us work. It's an insidious part, frankly, of our system. People have been sort of cowed into some people believing unions are bad. They're so corrupt, they're so bad, and then it's such a struggle to create them, and there's risk involved in creating them, and the workplace is often the last place you want to create risk.
It's interesting when you mentioned that how this issue of how few movies handle these kinds of issues. I also was thinking of something that Boots Riley said in an interview I listened to, where he said that it was really important to him. The first time we see Cash, he's sort of having this existential crisis, and like, what does my life mean? Is anyone going to remember me after I'm dead, and all this kind of stuff? And he said that you almost never see Black characters express those sorts of sentiments, and it was really important to him to do that in this movie.
Well, that's great. And yeah, and that I think speaks to how we do want to matter on one level, and for a lot of us, that means through our work, whether it's art or whether it's behind a desk, whatever work we do, that is deeply inbred in us, I think, just wanting to shine in some way and to have mattered. And there's so much room. You could almost name 50 things right now that we haven't seen depicted on film for Black men or Black women. There's so much room for what hasn't been shown, and the nuance of who we are as human beings.
I mean, do you want to just name a couple? Like, what would you?
Well, even exploring love stories is a big one for me, which is why I like Detroit so much. I like the fact that this was a relationship story, and it was a flawed relationship, but it was not a vitriolic relationship, even though they had problems. It remained a loving and supportive relationship even through the problems, and ultimately it was a philosophical issue driving them apart, which is so real in movement spaces. And I understand from recent reading that the nudity was stripped out of this film so that it wouldn't be catering to a male gaze, which I'm all here for, as I've just, as an artist, not an actress, but it's always bothered me so much that had I wanted to be an actress, that's like sort of a rite of passage. You have to be naked. Why? What does that have to do with my craft? So good for Tessa Thompson. This is the second role she's had as the girlfriend, another one in Creed, where I thought they were nuanced and realistic and really great characters.
Also,
the other thing. Oh, sorry, Craig, I cut you off. Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to mention the fact that it was nice to see a film that centered Black people, but it was not just sort of like a Tyler Perry side movie. It was a dystopia, and it was a comedy, but not sort of like a Tyler Perry type comedy, but a sort of serious comedy. Because a lot of movies sort of, they kind of turn movies into sort of Black movies in a way that, in the way that they're marketed, and I like the fact that this movie sort of, it was about race, but it wasn't necessarily just marketed to a Black audience, and it showed Black people in a different setting than we usually see them in.
One of the things I loved about this movie in terms of portrayals of Black life and the multiplicity that we don't see enough of, like Tananarive just mentioned, there's that scene where Cassius and Salvador, played by Jermaine Fowler, where they're getting each other's faces. This is, I think this is after he crosses the picket line for the first time, and they get into each other's face, and they're about to fight, and they're throwing insults at each other, and the scene is like teeming with this machismo and this aggressive energy, and you feel like, oh, they're about to come to blows. It's about to go down. But they just keep yelling at each other, and it doesn't do the expected street fight kind of thing. They jaw at each other, they yell, but they don't fight. And it was an interesting moment of like subverting expectations about what conflict looks like or has to look like, and how it can possibly be resolved. That wasn't a real resolution, but there's still that moment where they really, really seem like they were going to fight, and they have philosophical differences, but it doesn't necessarily have to turn into physical violence. You're like, "You smell great, brother. What are you wearing?" "Oh, nothing. It's just my natural scent." Yes, it was hilarious.
It was.
But also when I saw it the second time, I was like, "Wow, you know what? Like, that's a way of having a fight without having a fight." Mm-hmm. And a way of communicating that these guys still mean something to each other. They're just on different sides of a certain political spectrum right now.
And I heard Boots Riley say that his brother was in a confrontation exactly like that, and for years he was like, "I got to use this in a movie somewhere. This is great."
It is great. It is a great moment. And again, as with the relationship with Detroit, conflict avoidance. I mean, yeah, they have the conflict, but it doesn't have to go the melodramatic or stereotypical route, either in film or in life.
And later, when they reconcile, it's all the more beautiful. They're sitting in that restaurant, and Squeeze and Salvador and Cassius are all talking, and this is after Cassius has done his big revelation to try and tell the people about the Equusapiens, and he's frustrated, and they're like, "Hey, basically you fucked up, but we're still here for you. You saw the error of your ways." And it's a very generous and forgiving mode of interaction that sometimes the demands of drama and filmmaking and theater make you forget is possible to put on the screen or the stage.
Well, so we keep mentioning Equusapiens. I feel like people who haven't seen the movie are probably very confused about what's going on with that. But so let's set that up. So okay, so the Worryfree Corporation has this sort of douchebag CEO, played by Armie Hammer, who's a very sort of, he's like an Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos kind of bro, like Silicon Valley bro.
Yeah, he's a prototypical tech bro. And David, before we spoil this part of the movie, let me just say one of the amazing things about the discourse and the success of Sorry to Bother You is, it's not a thing that's been spoiled largely on Twitter. Like, I'm on Twitter every day.
No.
And I do not see people talking about the main plot point of this movie, which is a thing that is deserving of discourse and all the conversations that you can have on Twitter. But people have been really vigilant about not spoiling this movie, and I think it's wonderful. So now, that said, let's spoil it.
Well, yeah, and actually, before we spoil it 100%, I'll just say that I watched the movie and I was like, I gotta talk to people about this, but no one had seen it. But I told my dad the whole plot of the movie, and then I told my girlfriend the whole plot of the movie, and she really wanted to know what what they looked like, the thing that happens. And I went online. I couldn't, nothing I did, I could not find an image from the movie of of what happens at the end, which really surprised me. But yeah, it speaks to what you were saying about how people have been keeping it under wraps.
Yeah, half horse, half human, larger than humans, distorted faces, and large genitalia.
Right.
Very large. So what to me was amazing about the Equusapiens is, in all honesty, and this is the moment now where Cassius has sort of had his meeting with the tech bro, and is
actually, Tanner, let's draw a bridge to that.
Okay.
So could you just tell us? So Cash is he's upstairs, and he finds out that upstairs he's selling weapon systems and contract slave labor and stuff, and so this is even more ethically problematic than what he was doing before. But he keeps doing it, and he's so successful he gets invited to a party at the CEO's house. The guy's name is Steve Lifts, I think, right?
Yes.
Could you just talk about what? Just talk us through that when he goes to this party.
Well, sex, revelry, and drugs, as you might imagine. But also it becomes clear that he's going to be the pet Negro, at the party. And one of the most memorable scenes is when this basically all-white crowd demands that he rap, entertain us, do something. You have to do something. You've never capped anybody, every stereotype you can think of is thrown at this guy. And then his painful attempt to rap when he finally just gives up and is basically N-word, N-word, N-word. I was going to do the real thing, but no. N-word, N-word, N-word. And then they start chanting it back. And it's like also another surreal layer to the movie. It's like you're really Alice just falling through different levels of the looking glass. So by the time he stumbles away from all his new information and how awful the job is and the terrible things he would be doing and how badly he's being treated, and he ends up in this dark hallway, walks in a room where he thought he was directed to a bathroom, and hears someone calling for help, opens a stall, and there's this half man, half horse lying on the ground basically saying, "Help me." And this was me in the audience going, "Oh no, it's going to lose me. It's going to lose me." Because I had no idea. I mean, it's like just a stunning revelation in the film. It's from completely nowhere. And it really, though, redeems itself so much to me when this master plan emerges where Steve Lift is planning basically to make Cassius the king of the Equuhumans, or Equusapiens rather, sort of their guy on the inside, so he can infiltrate them and help subvert their movement before it even begins. I mean, they're planning for a revolution, and already if we make them, they're going to rebel, so here's what we'll do. They've got it planned out like 6 steps in advance. It's deep. And by the time Cassius is in the police truck and only has a slit of a view to see this protest that is getting more and more violent outside, and the Equusapiens show up and you realize the revolution has started, it was just such an exciting moment for me watching the film.
Craig, what did you think of the Equusapiens reveal?
I thought that it was so completely out of... it was one of those things that... I'm so glad that no one told me about it. I went in completely blind, knowing that it was going completely crazy. I love that reveal. I love the fact that that there is a sort of viewpoint in which they turned the Equusapiens into the way they treated African American labor in terms of the way it was sexualized, and that sort of the way. Oh yeah,
that was definitely intentional. When Steve Lift talks about the horse penis to Cassius, he talks about it as a plus. You get a horse dick.
Exactly. I thought that the entire thing where one of the Equusapiens was Forrest Whitaker. which the voice of, so I think that there was sort of a subtext that most of the Equusapiens were people of color. I think that was intentional.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very powerful and very funny too.
What did you think about, Tananarive was saying that it wasn't foreshadowed at all? I mean, I didn't notice any foreshadowing. Does anyone think there should have been more foreshadowing? Like that we knew there was something going, like there was the company had a horse logo, or just like we knew that there was something going on with horses, or did it work for you that it just comes so completely out of left field, or do you agree that it came completely out of left field?
So the second time I saw the movie, a bunch more details showed up. I could be remembering this poorly, but I feel like the dude in the picture, that little avatar that's kind of like Cash's conscience throughout the whole movie, I feel like the car he's standing next to is a Mustang.
Oh, get out. Oh, gosh.
That's hilarious. That's a triple pun at that point, to Tananarive. And I remember for sure that when Steve Lift offers the substance that we're led to believe is cocaine to Cassius, he gives it to him on a plate with like a horse's head on it.
Right.
It has like an equestrian theme to it, and he snorts that powder up. And the second time I saw it, I was like, oh damn, it's right there smacking you in the face.
And there's also the other part where the horses, it's sort of like when the reveal is sort of revealed to the rest of the world, they're sort of like, huh. Like the stocks for Steve Lift's company actually go up, and everyone's talking about it as a major innovation. That part was also brilliant too. The fact that people were just sort of like, oh, we're making people into horses. Big deal.
Yeah, I thought that rang so true, living in this current administration where every time something has happened with that, oh, well, that's it. They're done for now. It rolls, a couple news cycles roll around and nope, it's gone. It's gone.
No, exactly. And this is something that rings so false to me about so many dystopian science fiction movies is that, some corporation is secretly harvesting organs or something like that. And the heroes just have to get the word out and then everything will be fine. And the corporation will, the CEO will get taken to jail and stuff. And I never buy that, whenever I see it in any sort of dystopian science fiction movie, I'm always like, no, this would be completely legal. This corporation would have all the politicians in their pocket. They wouldn't need to keep it secret. And if they were keeping it secret, it wouldn't matter, because of apathy, exactly like you're saying. So yeah, I thought that redeemed a lot of sort of unpersuasive dystopian plots for me.
Yeah, so you would say sort of like Soylent Green is made out of people. And that right. Sort of thing.
Fake news.
Fake news. And also the reveal, the way he has to reveal it is that he goes on that show. Will you be punched punched in the balls or whatever it's called. And actually, he has to actually be punched before he finally reveals it.
And remember, literally covered in feces.
Yes.
Head to toe.
Yes.
So, wow.
Well, it's funny you mentioned getting kicked in the balls or whatever, because in this show, it's I got the shit kicked out of me, but in Idiocracy, the show everyone watches, is called Ow My Balls.
Oh.
And this reminded me, like, when I walked out of the theater, I was like, that's unlike anything I've ever seen before. But after sort of racking my brain, Idiocracy was one of the few things I could come up with that were sort of in the same ballpark. And that was one of that was one of them, the Ow My Balls kind of thing. But I saw one. So Josiah Hughes from Exclaim says this belongs to a rich tradition of satires, including, he says, Idiocracy, UHF, the Weird Al Yankovic movie, and then he also mentions Pootie Tang and Putney Swope. That I'm not familiar with, but I think Evan, did you mention Putney Swope, or did that come up in an interview?
When I talked, I'd seen some of the comparisons to Putney Swope too, and I talked to Boots about it when we spoke during the interview, and he said it was a movie he hadn't seen. Hold on, let me go look in the interview. Yeah, He said, "I've never seen Putney Swope." We talked in late May, if I remember correctly, or early June.
Could you just say what that is? Like,
Yeah, Putney Swope is a kind of corporate satire directed by Robert Downey Sr., in which a black laborer gets promoted to CEO in a corporation, and his voice is overdubbed with a white man's. I believe it's Downey Sr. himself. And there's a lot of revolutionary politics. This was in the late 60s or early 70s, if I remember correctly. And there were politics of black power and black liberation. And it had an anti-corporate stance as well. So, on a superficial level, it seems, to be operating in a similar notional space to Sorry to Bother You. Yeah, I think Sorry to Bother You is very much its own thing, though, and it has an energy of the moment and of black culture, black cultural practice at its core that Putney Swope didn't have.
Well, one headline I saw, it said something like, Sorry to Bother You and Get Out are part of a new wave of black surrealist filmmaking or something like that. And I know, Tananarive, you teach a class in black cinema, black horror cinema. Do you agree with that? Do you see these? Is there would you say it's sort of a wave of these types of films?
Well, it's funny you mention that because actually I have noticed a lot of Afro Surrealism at the forefront of entertainment now. I think of Get Out more as horror. There were a lot of comparisons to Get Out, some of them made just completely in ignorance, black film. But some people might argue that Get Out is also Afro Surrealist. Although to me, it's more horror, but these categories all merge, and they're all under the umbrella of what I would call Afrofuturism, which is the black speculative arts. But Afro-Surrealism, that term was coined long before the term Afrofuturism was even coined back in 1974 by Amiri Baraka. And it is this sort of dream logic storytelling that has, race, not at the center, as Craig says, but in this case, the fact that Lakeith Stanfield is a black actor is, pretty inarguable that it's addressing, at least erasure of black people, in these kinds of films. And there are some more subtle, specific racial messages in it, which I do think absolutely would qualify it as Afro-Surrealism. And I don't think it's coincidental that Lakeith Stanfield would be attracted to this project when you look at the work he's been doing in Atlanta, which has also become delightfully, surrealistic, especially in season 2. And anyone who's not familiar with Atlanta, when Donald Glover was at Saturday Night Live, he said, "And black people know me from Atlanta." And I just groaned. It's like, oh my God, everybody should know you from Atlanta. So please, just watch season 2 if you need to just jump in. And it's a way of addressing just that which makes no sense in a way that makes sense, is what I would say it is. It helps bring issues to the forefront, these absurd sorts of programming we watch, the absurd existence of capitalism, frankly, and make it look as absurd as it is. And that's very empowering and hopefully educational to people.
I also would say that it's kind of in conversation with something that's already been happening in black literature. I'm thinking of the work of Ishmael Reed. I'm thinking of Paul Beatty, the Sellout, and what is that? Colson Whitehead's work also is Afro-surreal. Like the entire book, The Intuitionist is about, the world where elevators have two different schools of thought, and the first black elevator and investigator, and of course Underground Railroad. And it's funny because I think that it's more in conversation with those literary pieces than it is with just movies.
Good point.
Yeah, the Sellout is, I'm actually working on an essay where I talk about this kind of stuff. And the Sellout is a book that seems to be vibrating at the exact same frequency as this movie. And they were created by different people in different media spaces. But I'm a big Paul Beatty fan, and And I think The White Boy Shuffle is one of the best novels to ever come out in the 20th century. That aside, yeah, it is very much of a piece of those works that everybody's mentioned. But I think the thing that's kind of frustrated me a little bit in the conversations around Sorry to Bother You is people don't talk about it as science fiction. It's a piece of science fiction. Mm-hmm. It's a great piece of science fiction. And the thing about it that is that it connects to a long tradition of science fiction talking about social ills and exploitation and injustices through metaphor. That's the thing about Sorry to Bother You that makes it very solidly science fiction to me, from a thematic aspect, from its actual plot mechanics. It's talking about genetic manipulation and hybridization. We're living in a world where genetic experimentation on animals happens all the time. And is often presented as a boon, as something that's going to make our lives easier or better in the future. But we all know that the gap between experimenting on animals and people is very, very small, especially as pertains to Black people. We can look, at the Tuskegee experiments as an example of that.
Speak on it.
Yeah, no, it's where we get used as a case study for something that affects society as a whole, but individual Black lives get impacted and harmed. You can also look at Henrietta Lacks and the way her body was actually profited off of. And to the greater good, yes, but no amount of compensation can ever be made for, creating treatment for illnesses from the Black bodies when those individual people did so without consent or compensation.
And I think it's worth noting, and those are great points, Evan, that the Tuskegee experiment and the fact that these men who had syphilis were not given the penicillin cure even after it was introduced, which was the particular insidiousness of it. So it's not just you're doing a study, but you're doing a study after you've already figured out what the cure is. And syphilis is a long, painful death. So it had a chilling effect on, especially the older generation and probably till now, with people who don't trust the doctor, and don't see after their health the way they should because of this fear. My mother, when I said I wanted to be an organ donor on my driver's license, was like, no, don't say that, because clearly her assumption was they would let me die to have that organ. That I would be my organ would be of more value than my life. So this is all real.
And it also, I personally have never submitted my DNA to one of these sequencing operations because, lately it's come out where that data winds up in places you don't necessarily have control over.
Mm-hmm.
There's an issue of consent over it, but, consent can be overridden. You can check off a box that says, hey, I don't want you guys sending my DNA to federal agencies. Federal agencies and governments can write laws that get around that stuff. So, and that skepticism, as conspiracy minded as it may sound, has its roots in real practices.
I want to go back, Evan, to what you were saying about this being science fiction. Boots Riley consistently describes this movie as, quote, absurdist dark comedy with magical realism and science fiction elements. Could you just say a little bit more about how you situate this as you said that this isn't a tradition of other science fiction stories. Could you talk about where it fits in among those other science fiction stories?
Yeah, I mean, you can look at something like Isaac Asimov's I think it was in the Foundation trilogy where he put the Laws of Robotics out. I may have the actual work wrong, but if the Laws of Robotics are I think a powerful metaphor for the civil rights movement. They weren't contemporaneous with each other, but when you talk about the Laws of Robotics, it's basically guidelines for how a sentient being can act, and those weren't well-meaning, but ultimately limiting. And, you look the way legislation has affected Black people's agency throughout the centuries, and you can say the same thing. Well-meaning, but ultimately harmful. And that's science fiction. You look at, obviously Star Trek, under the original vision of Gene Roddenberry, dealt with racism and Korean Vietnam War and what it meant for different political factions to fight against each other, and the individual cost of that. And he tried to envision a world where the racism we knew it at the time didn't exist, but he still imagined it to persist in other forms. So sorry to bother you. It obviously isn't like space opera, or it isn't like hard science fiction, futuristic sci-fi, like some of the other things I named. But the metaphorical freedom of science fiction has always let creators deal with the contemporary divisive injustices in their present day. And I think sorry to bother you is very much in that tradition.
Yeah, and then again, I have to throw out Octavia Butler. I think readers of Octavia Butler would be on the wavelength, even though she is devoid of humor almost completely in her work. That near future vision of the dystopia, capitalism run amok, basically individuals left to their own accord. That's all embedded in Sorry to Bother You.
It's interesting because, I listened to an interview with Boots Riley where he was saying he sort of got to a point in the screenplay where something, Cash has to see something that shocks him out of his complacency. But this isn't a world where people are okay with slavery. So what can happen that is a shock to his system, and that only a science fiction element can sort of ratchet it up to the level that he needed it to have that sort of intensity?
Yeah, a science fiction element, but also a science fiction element that feels near-fetched. Like as shocking as the Equussapien was at first glance, when you understand the whole plan and program, it makes perfect sense. It's almost like, oh, of course they would do that. Yeah. So, yeah, good on him.
Well, I would also like to point out that a while ago, I actually went to the National Academy of Sciences, and I heard Sherry Renee Thomas,
Oh, yes.
along with a bunch of other people, talking about the future of genetic editing. And they actually have this thing called CRISPR, where you can actually edit well, right now they only do animals, but they can edit people and make sure that you have certain genetic qualities that come out. And it's a real thing. It's not imagined at all. So it was, as weird as the Equusapiens was, it wasn't completely off the track. It also reminded me in many ways of the science fiction part of it. Kind of reminded me of the Oryx and Crake issue of Margaret Atwood, where it's genetic editing run amok. And also, in terms of Octavia Butler, it reminded me of her Lilith's Brood series, where you have these aliens that come, and they're basically just raping human beings. And it's good, but it's bad. That entire issue of what's happening and what is good and what is bad, and how people, sort of the power differentials, how she explored that.
One thing I want to add, to piggyback on something that Tananarive was saying, is that, that use of genre conventions to illuminate the lived experiences of Black people is, I think, the biggest thing that Sorry to Bother You has in common with Get Out. Obviously Jordan Peele brilliantly used, some very familiar horror tropes. You're in a location all by yourself, surrounded by people you don't know. The body switching, abduction, experimentation, mad scientist type experimentation. He used those all to talk about what it's like to be a Black person in America and have your culture and your body commodified in a way that you yourself don't get to profit from. And in a very real way. Boots Riley did some of the same things thematically, but through different plot mechanics. He did the same kind of thing in Sorry to Bother You. So I think if those projects are kindred in any way, that's probably the way that they're related to each other strongest.
I want to talk, before we run out of time, I want to talk about the very ending of this movie where there's this sort of uprising, Cash is part of this uprising of the Equusapiens, and they're breaking down Steve Lift's store and busting into his house and stuff. And one of the reviews I read, it was saying like, oh, this is kind of like a Black Mirror story, but in the Black Mirror story, it's always the end is virtually always we're totally fucked. There's nothing we can do. The system grinds you down and there's no fighting it. And this was very much the opposite of that. And I thought that was an interesting, interestingly original dystopian story in that way as well, is that and it's not just, like Neo discovers he has the power to like change the Matrix or whatever, but it's like, again, this sort of labor organizing, class struggle kind of message.
The movie is ultimately very hopeful, which, given the tonalities it walks you through, is very surprising for that to be the ultimate end. That yes, we can affect a revolution. Even as the systems in which we operate dehumanize us and transform us into, just meaningless meat sacks meant for labor. Even throughout all those terrible circumstances, you can affect revolution that changes your lives and the lives of other people and ultimately the world. It's not at all where I thought it was going to wind up. But when the Equusapiens storm Steve Lift's house, I'm like, oh shit, it's on. Like this is it's not just that they're going to die the horrible lives of being half man, half animal. They're going to seize their political power, physically, violently, and make sure that this doesn't happen to other people. I mean, that's how I read the ending of the movie.
Right. I agree that it was, to me, an uplifting ending, and it's the opposite of there's nothing we can do. There's everything we can do. And, movement doesn't have to end in storming and whatnot, but that is on the table too sometimes. And also there's organizing, and also there's just awareness of how we spend our money, where we spend our money. There are so many things we can do. So, and while resolving conflicts with our own, which I think is so important. It's, to me, one of those most important and resonant messages of positivity in this film is about creating partnership and brotherhood despite differences, which is where a lot of movement spaces trip up. And you see modern day activists read the history of movement and say, well, we're not going to fall into those traps that our parents fell into. And they do, because guess what? It's human nature. And it's, sometimes the enemy is us. We have to learn how to work together to affect change.
I'm curious how you guys just emotionally felt coming out of this movie, because it does have this sort of triumphant ending, but I felt unbelievably unsettled and like mind fucked coming out of the movie. It like really took me a while to sort of like for the world to seem real again after I walked out of it. So I'm just kind of curious, Craig, how would you describe your emotional state walking out of the theater?
I actually walked out and told the person who I was with, and I said, what the hell did I just see? I mean, I enjoyed it, but it was the first movie I've seen in a long, long time where it's just this beautiful mess, is what I would call it. I just love the fact that it completely defied everything. Because most movies, like I said, they have the first act, the second act, and then the third act. You know how it's all going to end. And I had no idea where it was going to end. And even that sort of last scene, the way that, it ended, it was dark, but it was also light. It was real, what do you call it? It was real sort of mind screwy. I love that about it. And that's kind of how I felt. I felt like, gloriously jolted into, seeing the world in a certain way.
I mean, is there anything, Craig, you would change about the movie? Or you said you like it as a mess. I mean, is there anything you would sort of like make unmessy, or do you think you would just keep it the way it is?
I would actually keep it the way it is. That's kind of there's a sort of guerrilla aspect to it that I actually like. I like the fact that it was sort of messy and sort of the tonal shifts were crazy. I like that part. That was my favorite part about it.
Well, how about Evan and Tananarive? Is there anything, do you have any criticisms of the movie or anything that you would change?
Not a criticism, just an emotional reaction, which was, the movie makes you uncomfortable in a way that it's hard to face, like Worryfree is clearly meant to be an analog for an operation like Amazon, right? Where the working conditions have been roundly criticized and reporting that's been done on them. And, you could certainly read Steve Lift as an analog for Jeff Bezos and people who are insanely rich like that. But the next time I used Amazon to get something delivered to my house, I felt really bad about it. There have been a few instances where it's been like, oh, you know what? Go to the store instead. Support a local business instead. Maybe a small business.
Walmart. No, I'm kidding.
I mean, there's small things, right? And it's small, and there's small actions that can feel meaningless or ineffectual by themselves. But one of the messages of the movie is that these small things we do can have can aggregate into large social movements. It's all it takes is 10 people hanging up their phones when it's peak call time, and all of a sudden the company loses enough profit that it makes them take notice. And you have a platform to negotiate on now. So the movie definitely made me think about, the ways in which we are all complicit in this late stage capitalism being a horrific system to operate under. That's a hard thing to deal with. I think it's totally intentional, and it's also totally useful.
Yeah, even the moments that made me the most uncomfortable, going back to Detroit's art show, her performance art piece, I wouldn't change it. It's just, it's hard to watch. It was hard to see. It was hard to see that done to her. And it was a painful message behind the art too, as well. So yes, struggling with, the fact that I use this little handheld computer every day that causes a lot of pain and hardship and some suicides in factories in China, and really engaging with how we as individuals can enact change. Our house is trying to transition to water bottles instead of using plastic water bottles, the disposable ones, the filtered ones. And it's tough. Even a little thing like that is a really tough change for a household, but it is individual actions. I mean, I know from my mother's stories that those big marches of 1,000 people always started with a conversation between 2 or 3. And that's what movement is, and it's lonely, and it can feel ineffective until suddenly it isn't, until suddenly it catches fire, and you have the March on Washington. And for that reason, I left the movie just feeling excited, a little bit overwhelmed, because there was a lot of sensory information I was still processing. I was still processing and was for a while, but even like Craig said, the messiness of it, the it's like, yes, it's just like in your face, and it's this way, it's that way, but it was all in service of a story that is pretty much in a straight line. The actual story and theme of the movie is pretty straightforward. It's just coming at it from some very unusual directions. And I am so excited to just be witness to the kind of art that is flourishing in 2018, really started before 2018, 2017. This is a remarkable period, a renaissance of Black art, Afrofuturism, Afro Surrealism, Black horror, all of it that we have secretly loved when it did not reflect us. But now we have an opportunity not only to be reflected, but to lead. And that is so important, because to speak to this sort of racial component of the film, yes, the main character is black, but it's not a black story. It's a story about capitalism. If black folks are safe, the rest of y'all will be fine. That's like sort of the whole rationale with Black Lives Matter. If you can keep black folks from getting shot down for no reason by police, then mentally ill white folks will need not worry. Because if you can protect the least, the Native Americans, if you can protect the most powerless in your society, there's a built-in cushion for people who are less powerless. And because we've been forced into movement spaces to try to make the country live up to its own constitution, we do have a capacity to lead that I think is really showing up in our art.
And I think it does. I mean, these movies do reach audiences that, other movies about black characters wouldn't necessarily reach, and do communicate aspects of the black experience that white audiences probably have never thought about in that way before. I mean, just certainly for me, watching the first scene of Get Out, where the neatly manicured lawns and hedges and trees of the white suburbs are presented as sort of the creepy in this sort of creepy horror movie way, made me think like, wow, I've never seen like, the suburbs as the enemy, as sort of like hostile territory. And of course, I feel dumb saying that, but the movie did make me feel that in a way that, just I had never like come up with on my own necessarily.
Then the project is doing its job.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just a really exciting time to be a fan of this kind of work and to see all the new directions, the new artists, and to be inspired.
I had an interesting experience watching Sorry to Bother You, where I felt like I was laughing pretty consistently throughout the whole movie, but I felt like there were lots of parts where I was the only person laughing. And I feel like there's something about the humor that is sort of, it's like not for everyone, or it's like, not everyone would get it, or like maybe people are not always sure if they're supposed to laugh at this or not. I mean, like you mentioned when Cash is sort of forced to rap in front of the white party audience. It's sort of, a lot of the humor is sort of on this line of uncomfortability, uncomfortableness, where you're like, wait, am I supposed to be laughing at this or not?
Mm. Yeah.
That's the thing that made me feel like the movie was so self-assured. Like, you could certainly cut that scene out and the rest of the message of the movie comes through loud and clear, right? That scene is not necessary for the kind of moment by moment progression of the plot. But tonally, it's the moment where Cash starts to go into this perverse mirror universe that's parallel to our own, right? This is what the halls of the super rich look like, and what you have to do in order to enter them. So from a thematic and tonal standpoint, it's necessary, but from a plot point, it's not necessary. And I loved that, it was so uncomfortable. I mean, I laughed both times that I saw it in the theater when I got to that scene. But yeah, it's Boots made the movie he wanted to make. He made the movie that spoke to his politics, and his vision of the world we live in. And I like that it's kind of unapologetic and uncompromising. Like all the stuff that Tananarive said about the moment we're living in and the kind of black art that we're seeing right now. Like it's kind of all on the table time, like we've got to put it all on the table because of the political moment that we're in now. Being safe or being polite, or civil, has been debated, in the political discourse of late. Like that maintains a very toxic status quo. And I think Boots recognized that, years ago when he was writing this movie. And if we want change to happen, we've got to be uncomfortable.
When I saw an interview where he said, that, people will go see this movie and 80% of them will walk out and say, yeah, like I agree with the message basically behind that movie. And that these are the people that need to be engaged, that we need to be reaching and need to be organizing and need to be engaged, because there's so many people out there who more or less are on the same page as probably we all are and the filmmakers are and so on, who are not, not being brought into this process.
Apathy is the enemy of change, right? That's I know it sounds trite, but it's true. And, like, there's a classic quote, Tananarive, I'm going to need your help here, but all evil needs to succeed is the inaction of good men. I'm butchering.
Yeah, right. But it's true. I mean, the silence or inaction, absolutely. Absolutely.
And like, if you didn't stop to think about the working conditions that you operate in, that other people you operate in, the things that you made, that you consume or are created in, and the politics and where the money goes, if you didn't stop to think about any of this stuff after seeing that movie, then you might be part of the problem.
Yeah. Yeah, the hardest thing to see is the water you're swimming in, So this is one of those pieces of art that can hold a mirror up to the audience and sort of help them better see the water we're all swimming in. Protest movements are not about them, they're about us. This has been such a long conversation, racism versus capitalism and all this kind of thing, but it's so true that we miss a large part of the conversation if we're only confronting racism, and that this is a conversation that involves everyone, who isn't a multi-billionaire. It's the conversation of our era, actually.
I mean, Craig, is there anything you want to add about, the relevance of this movie to our political moment or anything like that?
I think the movie is in conversation with a bunch of everything from the anti-capitalist notion of, say, a Mr. Robot and their sort of anti-capitalist ethos, as well as with Afro Surrealism, and I'm including even the work of, say, Carol Walker and her ways of recentering images of race and post-racial society.
I mean, is there any other specific movies? Like, what would be the next thing that people should watch if they liked Sorry to Bother You?
What I'm actually thinking of is that, once again, that instead of just movies, they should check out the works of Colson Whitehead and Paul Beatty. And there's also another wonderful novel, Pym, by, I believe his name is Matt Smith. Both of which deal with this, have this sort of absurdity that goes through it. So I would say that instead of movies, I would recommend people go to books.
Yeah. All right, so we're pretty much out of time. So how about I'll just get a final thought from everyone. So Craig, do you have any final thoughts about this movie, Sorry to Bother You?
That it's very on key about talking about the service industry in our post-manufacturing, post-capitalist society, and that it talks about how the corporations try to control the narrative.
All right, and how about Tananarive, final thoughts?
I'm just so excited, what a time to be alive, which is, I swing between, oh my gosh, we're all going to die, and what a time to be alive. But I'm going to land on the what a time to be alive piece, because this is an era of a new filmmaker I'm very excited about, and Boots Riley. Can't wait to see what he does next, what his influence will spawn, because, when one film opens with this kind of imagination, it gives other artists permission to engage their deeper imagination instead of sort of skating the surface of the imagination to fit popular films or popular tropes or how can I be this? Just be you. I think that's maybe the biggest message I get as an artist is do you and let Hollywood come to you. Do not try to do Hollywood.
And how about Evan? Final thought?
I just can't wait to see what Boots does next. I feel like to the extent that this movie has been successful, it is a rallying cry for work that centers political concerns, socio-political concerns, socioeconomic concerns, and can have them live through a cast that's primarily one of color, primarily Black, and can imagine our lives with more nuance, more comedy, more urgency and metaphorical power than they typically get, and through a mainstream Hollywood studio system. that's really encouraging. And like Tananarive said, we're living in a glorious, glorious moment right now. And living through these moments is always fraught because you feel like, all right, how much time do we have left before things get really pale and really boring again? But as these bodies of work continue to come out, I have emboldened hope that incremental, permanent change is possible with the kind of art we consume, what we say, and what's possible. So I think Sorry to Bother You is a really important movie for those reasons. That the headline of my review on IO9 was, and let me go to it because I forgot what it was. But yeah, my headline was Sorry to Bother You is the most surreal, important sci-fi movie in years. And I actually believe that. I believed it when I wrote it in March. I believe it now. And I believe it's going to be that way for years to come. And when movies and TV shows and other things come along that pick up the baton thematically that this movie has held out, we're gonna all be in a great place because of it.
Yeah, so for everyone listening, if you haven't seen this movie, Sorry to Bother You, definitely check it out. It's just one of the most original, like, mind-blowing things that you're gonna see. And yes, we're all out of time, so I think we're going to have to wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Evan Narcisse, Tananarive Due, and Craig Laurance Gidney. So thanks everyone so much for joining us.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Tananarive and Craig. It was great talking with you guys.
You all are amazing.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Evan Narcisse, Tananarive Due, and Craig Laurance Gidney for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to everyone who's given us 5 stars on iTunes, including Johnny Fever 79 in Canada, who writes, "Best podcast in the known universe. This is hands down my all-time favorite podcast. The host does a terrific job of lining up amazing guests or panelists, and covers a wide range of topics that always end up being super interesting. I'd rate it 6 stars if I could. It's that good." So, big thanks again to Johnny Fever 79 for that great review. Special thanks as well to Armin Nakashian and Leetmeister, who both just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And I want to give a special thank you to Richard Neary, who just signed up to make regular monthly payments to the show via PayPal. So big thanks again to Richard, and to everyone else who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.